Today we have Scott Powell with us, and Scott is got a BA in biology from McAllister College in Minnesota. His master's was from Duke, and a PhD at Montana State in the ecology department. Went on to do a postdoc at the Pacific Northwest Research Center or Research Station in Forest Service at Corvallis, Oregon, and then came back in 2009 and was an assistant research professor first, and has gone on a tenure track professor in the Land Resources and Environmental Science Department. Scott it does remote sensing and the kinds of things that go along with that, and is an ecologist. And so he's going to tell us today about advances in do-it-yourself remote sensing, which sounds interesting. So I'll let Scott take it from there.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Bruce, and thanks to the IOE for inviting me to present here today, of course. Thanks to all of you for showing up today. So I'm going to speak today about remote sensing. Wow, you don't hear that very often. So I'm glad you're that excited about remote sensing. So I came up with this title. I was sort of pressed by Anna Tuttle to come up with a title at one point this summer or early in the fall. So I came up with this title, Advances in Do-It-Yourself Remote Sensing. And I was thinking about my career in remote sensing as a remote sensing ecologist, and I was thinking about this term DIY, do-it-yourself. So I started reflecting upon the origin of this term, DIY. And so I think this term has a lot of traction in the home improvement industry, right? This is like Home Depot and Lowe's. But, I think of DIY as a fairly new term. It only dates back to like the 50s in common parlance. And so, at some point in history, there was no concept of DIY. You built your own house and that was that, right? But then over the course of the 20th century and economies diversifying and people having a little bit more free time, the concept of DIY began to emerge. And, far removed from being able to actually build your own house, you could go down to Home Depot and buy the materials and the tools necessary to reclaim a small part of what had been previously just in the hands of expert tradespeople. Building a house became the domain of expert tradespeople. So this concept of DIY sort of emerged later. Okay, so you're probably wondering, why am I talking so much about home improvement? So that's not my objective today, but I do think that the analogy with remote sensing is apt. Okay, so go back 100 years to the advent of the modern field of remote sensing. There was no concept of DIY, right? Remote sensing was you put a camera on a pigeon or on a kite or a balloon and you just sort of hope for the best, right? There was no DIY. Okay, and then slowly, or not so slowly, over the course of the 20th century, we have this massive technological advancement in remote sensing, fueled largely by a couple of world wars and the Cold War space race. And so remote sensing becomes this massive infrastructure endeavor. It sort of becomes in primarily the domain of only experts and big government, big business. Okay, and now today space is literally filled with satellites and junk, and there are many, many Earth observation satellite programs orbiting the Earth constantly. Okay, and so this is the era of big remote sensing. Increasingly, the observations that are available from these types of platforms are so important to further understanding of Earth system as a whole. So these are critical observations. But more and more, you're hearing this term do-it-yourself, DIY, and it's being applied now in the context of remote sensing. Okay, so this is sort of this novel era in remote sensing where remote sensing ecologists, people like me, we're sort of taking matters into our own hands. And this has been spurred on by technological developments in computing, in data processing, in drones. Okay, so these are ubiquitous things now. And so this is allowing this proliferation of technologies. And now, for better or for worse, drones are sort of everywhere. And people have visceral reactions about drones, and mostly because people are doing really stupid things with drones. They're crashing drones into hot springs, and they're crashing drones into the White House. There's a lot of militaristic associations with drones. Angry birds are ripping drones out of the sky. So there's, for better or for worse, like it or not, we live in this sort of new era of drones. And in my impression, the big elephant in the room is, when is Amazon going to start delivering packages with drones? That's kind of this next frontier of this drone world that we increasingly live in. And increasingly, drones are making their way into science now, okay? And so we have all these lofty claims about what drones can do for science. Advancing scientific research, improving scientific research, revolutionizing science, drones for agriculture, preventing the spread of desert locust swarms. There's all of these lofty claims. And increasingly, it's ecologists that are taking note of these trends too. Okay, so this is my favorite quote from Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment from a few years ago. I'll just read the quote because I think it encapsulates a lot of interesting stuff. So, in flying low and slow and being comparatively affordable, UAVs offer scientists new opportunities for scale-appropriate measurement of ecological phenomena, delivering fine spatial resolution data at user-controlled revisit periods. Okay, so I think this quote sort of perfectly encapsulates what's going on in this field of UAS remote sensing. Okay, and when I think back upon my own arc in my career as a remote sensing ecologist, I historically worked at very broad spatial scales, from regional to national to continental scales in remote sensing, using relatively coarse scale, moderate resolution to coarse resolution imagery. Okay, but now with these technological developments in UAS remote sensing, I'm increasingly working at finer scales. Okay, so this has been a big change in my perspective in remote sensing. And I think these finer scales are interesting because I believe that people can more easily relate to finer scale information. And I think that for management of resources, the finer scale information is a little bit more applicable for management of natural resources. And I do think it has the potential to open doors for improved ecological inquiry. Okay, so the finer grained observations, both spatially and temporally, are novel. And I think that, what's important to ask here, though, is, are we living up to this hype? Are we delivering on this promise of improved information at these finer resolutions? Are we preventing the spread of desert locust swarms? So that's kind of the challenge that I want to posit today, is, are remote sensing ecologists living up to this hype that we're seeing in the media? Okay, so what I want to do today is share with you some ongoing research that's going on in my group. And this has been going on for the last couple of years, so it's a fairly new area of research for me, so hence sort of the rough cut nature of this work. A lot of this work spawns from a 2014 College of Ag and Montana Ag Experiment Station equipment grant for the purchase of a UAS, sort of the system, the unmanned aerial system, which allowed us to purchase not only the drone, but also the sensors and the GPS equipment and the hardware and the software, sort of all the packages that encompass what I refer to as UAS. And just for reference, I'm sort of convolving UAV, which is the drone, the unmanned aerial vehicle, and UAS, the unmanned aerial system. So I tend to use those terms interchangeably, but they do mean different things. And so I want to give a shout out to this great team of collaborators. namely Diana, Rick, Mike, Aaron, Paul, Rachel, and Alex. You know, we're sort of the drone team in the Spatial Sciences Center. We came up with this term at one point, the MSUAV, to describe our activities. And so, you know, really they've become sort of a well-oiled machine over the last couple of years, and we've had some major challenges and obstacles that we've had to work through. It's been exciting, but we've logged at this point dozens, if not maybe hundreds of individual missions, and we've worked across a huge variety of ecosystems across the state of Montana. We've been working up in the Flathead Valley, out in the Muscle Shell Breaks, up in the Golden Triangle, down in southwest Montana, around the Bozeman area, and Upper Jefferson. And so, you know, we've really covered a range of different ecosystem types across Montana. And so what I plan to do today is to focus in on just two particular areas of research. One is the use of UAS for characterizing ecosystem composition and structure. And then the other is an application dealing with precision agriculture. Okay, so that's the setup. I do want to take one minor tangent here with this slide and talk about some teaching applications of this work. I've been teaching a graduate course in remote sensing for the last 5 or 6 years. And one of the trends that I'm noticing in my students is that a lot of students are now interested in or using drones for their research. And so this is this obvious trend that is also mirroring these broader trends in the industry. Okay, so there's a proliferation of this technology in this industry and in this field of research. And so in response to this desire to teach students more about this technology and these applications, I developed this 1-credit graduate seminar, Frontiers in Remote Sensing. The topics change from year to year when I change it, but I'm teaching it this spring, focusing on UAS applications in environmental science. And I think what's exciting here is that traditionally, when I've taught remote sensing, it's been primarily focused on you know, image processing and image analysis. So sort of the end products that are derived from remote sensing. But what's really cool here is that this is more of a full life cycle approach now for remote sensing. We're dealing much more with mission planning and with data acquisition, and then that leads into interesting questions for processing and image analysis. And so I think it's a much more hands-on approach in remote sensing, and I'm really enjoying this, and I think the students have a lot of traction and buy-in because it is more hands-on and they get to sort of participate in this broader life cycle for remote sensing. Okay, so moving into the first case study dealing with characterization of ecosystem composition and structure. I'm going to zoom in to this first study site. And so we're moving down into southwest Montana. This is the Upper Jefferson. This is Greenhorn Creek, which is a tributary of the Ruby River near Alder, Montana. And, excuse me. This first project, this case study dealing with ecosystem composition and structure. So this is work that is largely based upon Michael Oldham's graduate work, which he's currently working on right now. Diana Cooksey and Rob Payne have also been involved in this work, and they serve on his graduate committee. Nathan Korb from the Nature Conservancy has been instrumental in getting this project off the ground. And Aaron Whip and others in the lab have been really helpful with data collection. The funding for this project came primarily from Department of Land Resources and Environmental Sciences, as well as College of Ag and Montana Ag Experiment Station funding. So the project site is located on one of Ted Turner's ranches. This is the Snowcrest Ranch. And this is an area that quite a few people are interested in, including the Nature Conservancy, including the Forest Service, because they board around Turner Enterprises, and the Turner Ranch. And quite a few folks at MSU and in the academic community are also collaborating on research in this area broadly, and then also Greenhorn Creek specifically. So this is an animation based on some of the three-dimensional data from the UAS that we acquired at Greenhorn Creek at the study site. And as it zooms into this area, what I want to do is sort of describe one of the major ecological processes that we're interested in here that's going on in this landscape and in many other landscapes like it in the region. You have upland conifer, primarily juniper woodlands that are increasingly encroaching down into the historically deciduous hardwood riparian area. So you have this increasing density and extent of the juniper coniferous forest into the riparian bottomlands. Okay, and so one of the big uncertainties about this type of ecological process is what are the hydrologic consequences? And many of the managers in this region are sort of asking this question about how can we retain water in the system? How can we increase late season flows? And so folks like Rob Payne and his student Andy Bopst are working on this idea in this region on beaver mimicry structures to sort of slow water down in the system. And Jia Hu and her graduate student in ecology are working on understanding the differential water use between conifers and hardwoods in the system. So there's a lot of folks interested in this system. And the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Service and Turner Enterprises, they're all ready to go on management. They want to get in there and just remove juniper. That's their main objective at this point. And that's all well and good, but the big uncertainty, the big question, and this is where we come in as remote sensing scientists, is that surprisingly, we don't have good maps or information about the distribution or the extent or the density of these juniper woodlands. So, lacking baseline information, it's really hard to draw inference about the impact of conifer removal on ecosystem processes. And so that's our main objective here, is to improve the mapping of the composition and the forest structure in this environment so that we can inform baseline conditions that might help inform management decisions down the line and help us understand consequences of management decisions ecologically. Okay, so on the surface of things, it's, it seems like a pretty straightforward problem, right? Mapping juniper woodlands. It's been done many times before. And this is a classic upland context, right? Where you have juniper woodlands increasing in density and extent into sagebrush grassland environments. And that's kind of the classic example of juniper encroachment, right? And that's a fairly tractable problem from a remote sensing perspective. Okay, what makes this study a little bit more interesting and more complicated is that it's a riparian context. And so you've got this juniper increasingly mixed in with the deciduous willows and cottonwoods. And so it's all convolved. And from a remote sensing point of view, that's a much bigger challenge. So the problem is even more apparent than when you think about the range of basic data sources that are available or the types of maps that are currently available to address these problems. And so just as an example, here are the two most commonly used imagery sources for mapping vegetation. On the left-hand side, you have 30-meter resolution Landsat imagery. On the right-hand side, you have this 1-meter resolution NAPE imagery. Okay, and then this on the left-hand side is the National Land Cover Data Set, and on the right, just for reference again, is that NAPE image. This is the kind of map that people would instinctively turn to and say, well, what is the vegetation in that area? What do we know about vegetation distribution? So the National Land Cover Data Set is one of the primary sources for vegetation classification for land cover data across the conservative US. And you look at this riparian area, and they do map a little bit of evergreen forest there. They map this woody wetland class along the creek, But then the upland areas are basically mapped as grassland and shrub and sort of miss the patterns of encroachment. So, you know, this type of map would be really difficult to use to quantify the extent or the distribution of juniper woodlands, let alone tracking changes in conifer encroachment over time. And so our objectives for the study were simple, twofold. You know, one, to map or to classify vegetation according to the physiognomic class, so the hardwood versus conifer level of classification. And then two, to utilize the three-dimensional nature of the photogrammetric data derived from UAS to map the structural characteristics of this juniper woodlands. So in terms of the height, the crown area, the volume, the biomass. And so, you know, just so you know, there are obvious, as I mentioned before, there are many, many approaches for mapping juniper woodlands, including some of my own past work. This is an example of a recent report came out in 2017 from the USGS that mapped juniper woodlands regionally across the state of Nevada. And you know, they focus exclusively on two-dimensional, high spatial resolution imagery, and they focus primarily on this upland juniper context. And so they report a 75% accuracy of mapping juniper woodlands, but they do acknowledge that there's significant confusion in riparian areas. So this is our fundamental challenge in the study here. And so what Mike did was he laid out a sample of field plots along Greenhorn Creek, capturing some of the riparian area, some of the upland areas. And within each of these plots, he measured the species composition, the percent cover, and also some of the structural characteristics of the juniper tree, so the height, the crown area, and so forth. And then he planned missions and acquired imagery using two different sensors. So on the left-hand side, we have an example of the RGB, so the red, green, blue wavelength sensor. This is a visible camera, 12 megapixels. It produces pixels that are as fine as 3.5 centimeters. So these are tiny pixels, okay, in remote sensing. And then on the right-hand side, we have an example from the NIR, the near infrared sensor. It captures spectral information in the green, the red edge, and the near infrared wavelengths in particular. So this is a coarser scale, coarser spatial scale sensor, only 1.2 megapixels, so 10 centimeter pixels. That's our coarse scale sensors, 10 centimeter pixels. But it has better spectral resolution because it includes the near infrared. So, and near infrared is typically considered an improvement for mapping vegetation. Okay, and then in a nutshell, you know, this slide is sort of how does UAS work? How does photogrammetry work? And so UAS works by capturing many, many hundreds of images over a study site and then finding these common tie points. And so you can see these tie points in this little schematic down here. And then, you know, these are also representative of the tie points. So many images find common tie points that are common across images as the sensor is moving and collecting these images. And by doing so, you can create both accurate two-dimensional orthophotos and three-dimensional surface models. And this is a technique, this is a data processing and analysis technique called structure from motion. And I don't know if anybody's heard that term before, but it's becoming a ubiquitous term in remote sensing, and it's really blossomed with the proliferation of UAS imagery and photogrammetry. And so I've heard people refer to this era in remote sensing as the rebirth of photogrammetry. So photogrammetry is an old discipline, but now it's boosted with this technology from data processing and these types of images. And so it's kind of an interesting era in remote sensing. So what makes these photogrammetric data different than other traditional high resolution aerial imagery is the three-dimensional component, is the structure from motion, the 3D surface model aspects. And so, until fairly recently, if you wanted three-dimensional structural information, basically your options were LiDAR. Okay, and LiDAR is very expensive to acquire, and it's not available everywhere. Okay, and so I like to think of this photogrammetric approach as sort of LiDAR light. Okay, because for the first return, so for the, say, like a bare earth example where there's no vegetation, it's equivalent to LiDAR, and the accuracies are equivalent. But where LiDAR excels and the photogrammetric or UAS approach doesn't really work is providing a more detailed investigation of structural components. And so you can see in this schematic here, you have a comparison of the photogrammetric point cloud with the LiDAR-derived point cloud. And so where LiDAR, the pulses from LiDAR, because it's an active sensor, can actually penetrate a forest canopy and return information about the sub-canopy layers, the structural information within that canopy. The photogrammetric approach does not do that, but it does provide the same basic assessment for surfaces. So for the top of the canopy or the ground surface where it's visible. So this is one of the major things that we wanted to explore and understand in our study was the capability of the photogrammetric approach to give us structural information about this encroaching juniper woodland. It's a far less expensive approach than LiDAR, and it could be equivalent in certain types of environments, like a low-density open juniper woodland. It could potentially be equivalent, but in a closed canopy dense forest, they're not equivalent. Okay, and then the classification issue. So this classification, or this is what the term we use for mapping vegetation, is particularly challenging with this kind of high spatial resolution information that we're acquiring from drones. Traditionally, classifiers for remote sensing would operate at the pixel level, okay? But in this case, our pixels are so small, right? 3 to 10 centimeters, that they're actually sub-feature scale that you want to map. So we use a process, a technique called object-based image analysis. And in this object-based image analysis, we group pixels together we segment the pixels based on spatial and spectral and textural similarity into objects. And the objects then more closely resemble the features that you want to map. And then we run a classifier on the objects. In our case, we used a classifier, random forest. And so, here are examples of some of the maps that we derived using this approach. So here's the RGB camera, here's the NIR sensor, and then the two maps derived from those two different sensors. Statistically, those two maps were equivalent, although there are minor differences. Here's a zoomed in example along Greenhorn Creek showing the NIR image and the RGB image and the maps derived from those two different sensors. And this is basically meant to illustrate sort of the level of classification detail that you can achieve with this approach. And then we assessed the accuracy of these maps. And this is an example of one of the error matrices. We also call these confusion matrices. So along the left-hand side, we have the mapped classes, and along the top row, we have the reference or the truth. So along the diagonal, we have agreement between what we mapped and what we know to be truth in the field. And so I'll point you to a couple of different things. One is that overall, the accuracy was about 85% of the map. Okay? The class accuracies for coniferous and deciduous were about 82%, 78% accurate. Okay, and most of the confusion, as you can see, is between coniferous and deciduous. Okay, and I'll get at in a bit some potential improvements for that specific confusion. Okay, so you're probably thinking 85%, that sounds pretty lousy, right? But let me show you an example of the NLCD map again, and then our map here. A couple of things to point out. One is that, believe it or not, the accuracy sort of standard in land cover classification is 85%. Okay, so and the NLCD map is about 82% accurate. And then for the classes that are mapped in the riparian area, the evergreen forest is 76%. The woody wetlands accuracy is 54%. So not as good as our map statistically, but also, you know, from a ecological and a management perspective, the amount and the type of information that's conveyed in these two different maps is just fundamentally different. Okay, so then the second aspect, the second part of this research was then mapping the structural characteristics of the juniper woodlands. Okay, so on the left-hand side is an example of the process that was used to derive the crown area from individually mapped juniper trees. And on the right-hand side, you have the three-dimensional surface model that was used to extract the tree heights. So you can see the juniper trees clearly sticking out about, you know, clearly sticking out from the ground surface, from that bare ground surrounding it, the grassland and the shrubland. You get a little glimpse of the problem as you move into the riparian here down on the bottom right-hand corner of that image on the far right, where you have more of a closed canopy system, and we assume that the process really won't work as well in that sort of closed canopy system. So this is a validation of the crown area. So we have our estimated crown area here on the y-axis, and then the field measured crown area on the x-axis. And you can see there's basically a pretty good fit there with that relationship, except for this one notable outlier. And that's where this cluster of juniper trees the juniper are growing in a cluster. And so the imagery is not able to partition the individual crowns. And so the error is highly inflated because of that. Then this is a scatter plot of the estimated versus field measured tree heights. Okay, so again, a pretty decent linear fit, but you can notice that we tend to underestimate. There's a systematic underestimation of heights across the study area. And I think that's due to the fact that the juniper trees have this narrow leader at the top of the tree, and we were easily able to measure that in the field, but the imagery could not resolve that leader, so we underestimate that tree heights. Okay, so just a quick summary about this first case study. So what did we learn in terms of mapping composition? We could accurately map the physiognomic composition and create detailed maps at fine scales. The most obvious improvement we can make to this to address this fact that coniferous and deciduous are still highly convolved in the riparian area is to include seasonal imagery and just leverage the capability of UAS imagery for user-controlled revisit periods. So if we use leaf-off imagery when the deciduous trees have lost their leaves and the coniferous trees still have their leaves, I'm pretty confident we can minimize a lot of that confusion. As far as structural estimates, we can accurately estimate structure in the low-density woodlands. And in this case, this could really be an inexpensive alternative to LiDAR. It's less accurate in the higher density woodlands, but it still could be used as a complement to existing LiDAR data sets. So if you had LiDAR data, you could use photogrammetric data as an update to track changes in canopy heights if you know the ground surface elevation. Okay, but look at these two images here. So that's a raptor, obviously, on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side is the drone. Okay, and so they look pretty similar, right? And so it's no surprise that raptors are not big fans of drones. And so one day out at Greenhorn Creek, this raptor got really curious about the drone and kind of gave it a love tap. And we were able to land the drone without any damage. We came back the next day, foolishly, and we were not so lucky. So this is the drone after being attacked in midair, basically destroyed. And miraculously, this $10,000 camera was undamaged. The rest of the drone, the internal components were were wiped out. So my point is that we learned our lessons about the limitations of this technology as well. You know, from that point forward, we became much more vigilant. We practiced our raptor avoidance techniques. We put reflective tape on the wings. We had a spotter with binoculars on the drone looking for raptors the entire time it was in the air. So we were much more vigilant and aware of the circumstances. And, you know, unfortunately, this compromised Mike's research. You know, from that point forward, he couldn't collect more of that seasonal imagery that I was referring to. And so, you know, sometimes you just have to acknowledge that nature wins and you have to move on and pick a different study site. So that was a big lesson for us. Okay. Let me move on to the second case study now, dealing with precision agriculture. And, you know, as you probably already know, precision ag is a major area of research for UAS because of the direct management implications. You know, this is a technology that agricultural producers and agricultural scientists are really excited about getting their hands on to potentially improve management. So I will zoom in to the general location of this second case study where we've been working up in the Great Falls area. And this case study, UAS for Precision Agriculture, this has been primarily funded from 2 years of Montana Wheat and Barley Committee funding with Paul Stoy and Bruce Maxwell as co-PIs. We've been working with an agricultural producer in that region, Chuck Merja, who's super excited about new technologies. And Aaron Whip and Mike Oldham did a lot of the heavy lifting on this project in terms of driving back and forth and collecting imagery and processing imagery. So a big thanks to them. So the major question that we're trying to wrap our heads around for this project is what drives the field scale variability in yield and protein content. So obviously producers want to maximize both yield and protein content, and they want to minimize their inputs to correct these perceived deficiencies. And in reality, you know, this is what fields look like. There is field scale variability in both yield and protein content. And so then there is necessary variability in the inputs that are required to address this. And by creating detailed spatial and temporal information about this type of field scale variability, we can help producers improve management decisions and optimize the timing and the amount of inputs, and hopefully help them manage more sustainably. So the basic approach here, obviously, is fine scale mapping with UAS. And so this is an example on a map. On the right-hand side, this is a color infrared image of a field. So the red depicts green, vigorous vegetation. The cyan is bare ground or stressed vegetation. And so you get these incredible patterns spatially of stressed vegetation. And this could be due to any number of factors. And so agricultural producers can use this information in a precision ag context for variable rate applications of nitrogen or soil amendments or herbicides, as the case might be. And we're pairing this approach, this fine scale mapping approach, with Paul Stoy's eddy covariance flux observations, which are incredibly temporally detailed observations of plant carbon uptake and plant water use. And so the pairing of these two approaches can hopefully provide an improved assessment of the drivers of the variability in things like yield and protein content. Okay, so the basic objectives in this study here, it's really simple, just mapping the spatial and temporal variability in crop greenness through a couple of growing seasons, and then examining the relationships between the UAV, the imagery, and then the field-based measurements of yield and protein content. So we have two different growing seasons here. In 2016, we were working in a winter wheat field, and we collected 4 dates of normalized difference vegetation index. So the NDVI is basically incorporating spectral information in the near infrared, and the red channels that are well corresponding with vegetation greenness and vigor. So that's our proxy for vegetation greenness, essentially. In 2017, in a spring wheat field, we collected 10 dates of UAV measurements of NDVI. Okay. So then to assess the correspondence between the imagery and the field data that were collected from a combine, we had to average the NDVI values in these rectangular buffers to sort of approximate that footprint of the combine sensor. So this is an example on the left-hand side there of the yield measurements. And then, in a nutshell, both yield and protein content are positively correlated with NDVI. That's not always the case as far as protein content goes. I would say with yield, it would probably always be positively correlated, but protein content can be variably correlated with NDVI. And these two can be inversely related depending on field conditions. So then I'm going to go through the sequence of the 10 dates of imagery that we collected in 2017. This is a 125 hectare field planted with spring wheat. This is the location of the flux tower, that little green dot. And these are going to be color infrared images. So again, the vegetation is red, and the cyan represents bare ground, basically, or stressed vegetation in some cases. And then, so I'll go through the sequence like this, where I'll show the color infrared image on the right, and on the left is the NDVI image. So this is pre-planting, it's just bare ground. The NDVI is ostensibly 0. Okay, so then June 21st, this is our first date where we have the crop emerging. The crop is in the tillering phase. You can see in the color infrared image, there's some red, which represents the green vegetative growth, but you can still see a lot of the background bare soil reflectance. June 21st, this is still June 21st. Now you can see that the NDVI is relatively low, and there's still there's some patterns emerging in the variability in NDVI. Okay, by June 29th, the stems are elongating. There's a more uniform reddish color now, a more vigorous crop growing, obviously. And NDVI is now becoming somewhat uniform across that entire field. This is sort of the peak NDVI almost. By July 5th, the stems are still elongating. You're seeing a little bit more variability now in terms of the NDVI. You see areas that are beginning to dry out. And by July 12th, now the crop is actually heading, and there's basically a closed canopy of wheat in the field now. And the NDVI shows a lot of different patterns now. So you see areas of high NDVI, areas of low NDVI. You see these interesting cracks, sort of. These are shale cracks in the soil that are retaining a lot of soil moisture, and so are staying relatively green. July 19th, the crop is now flowering. You can see it's evidently drying out and beginning to mature. The NDVI patterns are pretty evident now. And then July 25th, I do not have a photograph from the field, but you do see the color infrared image on the right. And the NDVI patterns on July 25th are becoming fairly pronounced, but the field is now, at this point, the wheat crop is fairly mature at this point. What's the term for this, Bruce? This is on August 2nd. This is the ripening stage, I believe. That's what you might refer to that. And what's interesting here is you can see these patterns now. So the wheat crop is mature and brown. But in the background here, you're seeing this green vegetation, and you're seeing some green still sprinkled in. And in the NDVI image, you can now start to see these areas of relatively higher NDVI emerging in this lower right-hand corner of the image. So August 9th, now the crop is ripening, and it's quite mature. It's getting pretty close to harvest. There's virtually no green vegetation left except for some scattered evidence of green vegetation in that lower right-hand corner. August 9th, NDVI is very low. August 16th, so this is the last date of imaging that we performed here, and the crop was then harvested shortly thereafter. You can see this reddish pattern in the lower right-hand corner there. Not sure if you can make that out. In the NDVI image, you can see relatively higher NDVI now, in contrast to the rest of the crop, which is basically a static low NDVI now. So, okay, so thanks for bearing with me on that 10-date sequence. The point is that you look at this 2.5 months of an entire growing season now, and it's, you know, there are these interesting spatial and temporal patterns, but it's kind of a mystery, like what that really means, and how do you understand what this, what the implications of these patterns are. So to help us better understand that, we took all of these 10 images and we stacked them into this composite image. And on that composite image, we performed an unsupervised classification. So basically identifying spatial and temporal clusters. And then these clusters are partitioned based on their trajectory of NDVI. So it's their temporal trajectories, their spatio-temporal trajectories of NDVI. And so we were able to group those trajectories into these 4 basic classes: a high, a medium, and a low NDVI trajectory class. And then this 4th class that's associated with this weed infestation that is spatially and temporally distinct from the wheat crop. And so that really stands out. That's that purple class there in the lower right-hand corner. So then we plotted the average NDVI trajectories for each of these 4 classes, and that's what you see on the right-hand side there. The x-axis is the day of the year, and then the y-axis is the NDVI. And so this is basically the NDVI trajectory over the course of the growing season. And so, for example, the high NDVI class stays higher, relatively greener, and stays greener longer than the other classes do. And so the key question here is, you know, what's driving these differences in NDVI trajectories? It could be due to different factors. It could be due to inherent differences in soil water holding capacity across the field, okay? Or they could be due to differential, to deficiencies in nitrogen across the crop, okay? So understanding what these potential drivers of NDVI is critical for understanding a management action here. So, for example, if differences in soil water holding capacity are driving these differences in NDVI, then one management action might be to go sort of mid-season and counterintuitively apply nitrogen to the high NDVI places that have relatively high yield and boost the protein content, okay? Alternatively, if nitrogen deficiencies are driving these differences in NDVI trajectories, then you might target the areas of low NDVI earlier in the growing season and then boost the protein content and the yield in these lower NDVI places. And so, you know, examining these spatial and temporal patterns is pretty interesting, and it's a little bit of a mystery to me, and this is sort of the rough cut aspect of this, is I'm just learning in an agroecology context what these types of patterns mean. But I think it's fascinating, and I think it makes me wonder, at what point could you provide imagery like this to an agricultural producer? What could you provide that information early enough in a growing season to make a difference? You know, if you only had, you know, this one date, peak NDVI, would that be enough to understand a management decision to boost protein content or yield? So these are the kinds of questions that I'm still wrestling with in terms of interpreting the output that we're getting from this type of imagery. Okay, so just to briefly summarize the UAS work in the precision ag context, you know, undoubtedly the UAV captures this detailed spatial and temporal variability in crop development. And this is a process that's relatively simple and inexpensive. And an ag producer can control the data acquisition to target specific times in the growing season to optimize decision making, okay? So let me try to wrap this up here. And in conclusion, what I want to do is go back to this quote that I brought up at the beginning of the talk. Okay, I'd like to sort of break apart this quote piece by piece. And I'll start with this concept of flying low and slow. So flying low is mostly a regulatory issue. So we're obligated by the FAA to fly below 400 feet, okay? Which has advantages for producing fine scale information. Okay, we get really small pixels when we fly really low. Okay, but it has definite disadvantages for being able to image large areas and cover more ground. And then the flying slow aspect, which is important for photogrammetry, is a bit of a liability when it comes to raptors. Okay, so we sort of, you know, the drone is a bit of a sitting duck for raptors. And so flying low and slow is not necessarily advantageous. It can be in some circumstances, but not in others. Okay, the affordability issue. Yes, UAS remote sensing in the context of other available data sets like LiDAR or other high spatial resolution imagery, it is relatively affordable, okay? Excuse me a second. I think a misperception though about the cost comes down to the difference between UAV versus UAS. And so yeah, the drone is a relatively inexpensive thing, and especially in the hobbyist context, you know, drones are relatively inexpensive. But the UAS, the system, is not inexpensive. And so when it comes to GPS equipment, hardware, software, and especially sensors, this is not an inexpensive technology. And so the cost is obviously going to come down, but this is remaining in the hands of researchers in the private sectors, and it's not quite in the hands of the end user yet because of cost and perhaps also because of learning curve issues. The scale appropriateness, okay. Yeah, the high spatial resolution imagery is amazing for mapping fine scale processes. Like in the juniper woodlands example, we could map sort of the ecological scale of that issue. In the precision ag context, we could map at that management scale. But that resolution comes with some trade-offs too, because you have a lot of data, okay, sometimes too much data to deal with. You also have the issue of classification that we talked about. So this fine scale imagery is a particular challenge for mapping vegetation communities. And then, you know, the fine scale imagery, in some cases, it's too fine. So for agricultural management, you know, the variable rate applicators are not quite that fine scale yet. So we're you know, creating so much information that it's sort of subscale of management, which is an interesting dilemma. And then the issue of user-controlled revisit periods. I think this is probably the most important aspect of UAS remote sensing and this photogrammetric approach is that ecologists and the end user actually can control the revisit periods and can control data acquisition. And so you can think of so many amazing examples of phenology, of flowering, of leaf off, leaf on, leaf off, flooding events. For scientific inquiry, being able to acquire imagery pre-treatment, post-treatment, or in an ag management system, pre-harvest, post-harvest, or in a forestry system, the attack of a pathogen or the attack of an insect. So being able to time that data acquisition is what's really novel here, okay? But so, you know, in conclusion, I think what's really exciting and perhaps the most novel thing here is that remote sensing is increasingly this DIY enterprise. And this is good news. I mean, this is sort of the democratization of remote sensing and the democratization of science in general. And it doesn't in any way threaten you know, big remote sensing, the government, the multinational, the private sector remote sensing. If anything, they complement one another. And so, you know, moving forward, I think this is an exciting time to be a remote sensing ecologist because now ecologists have another amazing tool in their toolkit to complement other observations and other data sets and other approaches. So anyway, that's what I want to talk to you today about, and thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it. Did not leave as much time for questions as I was hoping. Yes, Tad.
So you're gonna set me up on my farm.
Okay.
And you can do all these things, looking at something at maximum NDVI. How much do you see doing this for 5 years on my place and being able to firmly set me up? There'll be some weather variation that we go there, but there ought to be a lot of bridging among years where you can do me up right and then maybe give me some general guidance. Are you thinking that way?
The technology is sort of handed off to the ag producer. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think in some cases that's happening. For high commodity crops, undoubtedly. For nut crops and wineries, I think that in those situations the investment is worth it. For lower commodity crops, I'm not sure that we're really there yet on a as widespread a basis, but I think as the costs come down, as the learning curve sort of gets less steep, then we'll get there pretty soon. It would be my hunch. Yes?
It's like really fascinating tool to apply technology. What about applying it to water systems? Are there variables that can be measured in rivers?
Yeah, I didn't show the example here. I have a thermal camera that is capable of measuring water temperature. And so the hydrologists are really interested in that. Rob Payne and his student Andy Bobst are looking at mapping thermal water temperatures using UAS. For looking at the impact of beaver mimicry structures on water temperature. So yeah, I think there's definitely aquatic applications.
Is there any other resolution in the water, like spawning reds or?
Yeah, I think because of the high spatial resolution of the imagery, if you can, you can penetrate the visible wavelengths can penetrate the water a little bit. So in shallow environments, that would work. Yeah. I haven't seen that particular application, but that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I understand that the regulation of the drones has been changing a lot, but there was a long delay in coming out with rules. And I heard that the rules the FAA came out with have now been thrown out. Or what kinds of constraints have you faced in terms of just making sure that you're doing everything legally?
Yeah, so I knew I would get a question about this, so I'm prepared. So when we embarked on this 3 years ago, the regulatory landscape was much more challenging, and we went through a lengthy process to acquire a certificate of authorization with the FAA. And then in 2016, they dramatically relaxed the laws. And so now there's a new small UAS rule for drones under 55 pounds. And that basically opens up pathways to using this technology much more easily than the previous system. So we spent a lot of time, Diana Cooksey in particular spent a lot of time researching the regulatory landscape. And what's interesting is that if you compare the requirements for recreational versus work, the hobbyists are not bound by any of the same regulations. Ostensibly, they don't need a pilot's license. They don't need a small UAS license to go fly a drone. Your kid doesn't need that, but you do if you're flying it professionally. And so there's sort of two different standards in the field right now. I'm happy to help to talk to you about that more if you want to know more of the nuts and bolts. It's a lot of details to work through.
All right, we should conclude there. Thank you.